There's a story we like to tell about Africa. It's a story of unity, shared struggle, oneness. A story of a continent bound together by history and possibility. It's a very powerful story. And I think in many ways, it's a very honest story. However, it's not the only one. Because alongside that story, there's another reality, one that shows up in moments of tension and conflict, in protests, in social media exchanges, and sometimes, and unfortunately, in violence. Over the years, we've seen recurring clashes between South Africans and Nigerians. Businesses would be looted, sometimes during protests, communities targeted, and diplomatic tensions rising, as one would in fact expect. And each time, the conversation follows a similar pattern: condemnation, political statements, and then calls for unity. And after all of that, silence. Until the next incident. Then the same cycle repeats itself. So today I want to ask the uncomfortable question: are the cracks showing in this African unity? That these cracks, in fact, are not external, but in fact internal? And do they begin with our inability to be honest about how we actually treat each other? I am Sebenzile Nkambule, and this is Context. So let's ground this conversation in reality. Tensions between South Africans and Nigerians have surfaced repeatedly, and over the past decade, that has been the case. I'll take you back to 2019 during the xenophobic violence in South Africa, which led to some attacks and destruction of foreign-owned businesses. There was displacement that we saw, and then retaliatory protests in Nigeria. You'll remember those. And these included attacks on South African-owned companies in Nigeria as well. These were very unfortunate scenes that we saw during that time. It wasn't just a local issue. It became a continental issue, a moment where African unity was tested, and tested publicly at that. And since then, the tension has never disappeared. In part, the tension is as a result of these two nations being giants on the continent. And I would argue, and the data supports this, that Nigeria is the giant of the continent. Large population, huge economic potential. However, though, the bravado that you see, how ambitious both nations, in fact, are in striving to be the best at what they do. If you think about entertainment as well, and all the ways in which you want to export all of the good things that come from both countries. So the tension will always be there. It's a healthy tension for the most part. But in fact, perhaps we're seeing it grow more and more less healthy. It has simply become quieter if you think about it when we talk about this idea of African unity or unity between these two nations. Sometimes, though, it's expressed through stereotypes. You see the online hostility, a lot of it you see on platforms such as Facebook. There's professional exclusion as well that you hear about, and cultural mistrust as well when these stereotypes are perpetuated. So the issue is not whether conflict exists. It really is whether we are prepared and willing to have a healthy and an open discussion about it. Let's look at the narrative that each side tells. If you listen very closely, if you follow some of these pages, or if members of both nations are in fact part of your community, you'll hear that each side has their own version about what is happening. In South Africa, you often hear they're taking opportunities, they're involved in crime, they're selling drugs. We are protecting what is ours. In Nigeria, you'll hear them talk about how they are being targeted unfairly, that South Africans, in fact, pick on them and not necessarily treating them fairly, and that it isn't all of them that are doing these things they are being accused of. Nigerians will say we contribute economically, we are treated with hostility, even though we do bring some good into the country. Now, both narratives will have an element of truth, naturally. And they both contain distortions as well. Naturally. Because beneath them is, in fact, something deeper. Competition, economic pressure, identity, issues of belonging. And when those pressures, in fact, are not addressed at all levels of society, not just at a community level, which is where we hear and see a lot of the action, as we saw in Gugompo just the other day, but all levels of society right up to government level. If these issues are not addressed, they turn into conflict between people. So, is it just xenophobia that we're talking about here? Is it just Afrophobia that is the case here? The tensions are shaped by a range of issues. South Africans complain about issues of unemployment. And when it comes particularly to Nigerians, the crime element is certainly amplified a lot more than would be the case if you're talking about Africans of other nationalities, people coming from Zimbabwe, our neighbors. We know we've got millions of Zimbabweans in the country. It's easy to call this xenophobia. And look, in many cases it is, right? But that's not the complete picture, because these tensions are shaped by unemployment, inequality, weak economic systems, and frustrations with government failure. When systems fail to provide opportunity for its people, people begin to compete for what is available. And when that competition becomes intense, outsiders are often seen as a threat. This, of course, doesn't justify the behavior, but it does help us understand it. And without understanding the drivers, we cannot meaningfully address the outcome. I think this is true when we talk about Africans from other countries like Zimbabwe, and we speak a lot about Zimbabweans because they are neighbors, and we know over the years the various measures that have been taken to support them. Think about the ZEPs, the special permits that were designed for Zimbabweans in particular, given the socioeconomic and political situations that they were facing, that they were coming in droves. And so we needed to treat their situation quite differently. We're in 2026 now. A lot has shifted, but a lot still hasn't changed. If anything, we're seeing more and more numbers. And so this is why you hear the growing frustration and the tensions from South Africans who are saying, hang on a second. South Africa cannot be home to anybody and everybody that is facing some or other issue in their country. Because not everybody who comes here is actually living under conditions of war and running away from home. Not everybody who's making their way from their countries to come and find a home here or explore economic opportunities is facing some or other dire economic circumstances there. Yes, we get that. But I want to just perhaps limit ourselves to the conversation around Nigerians, in particular because of the recent issues that we have seen. Here are people who move all over the world and they leave their country. And so South Africa was never going to be isolated from there. People come here for different reasons, lovely weather, opportunities that they can then explore. So why wouldn't Nigerians do the same? I do think it is the tensions I spoke about earlier on about the bravado that Nigerians in particular carry. Also quite unique to, I think, how other West Africans carry themselves. There's no other grouping or people like Nigerians. And if you've had the privilege of traveling there, you'd understand where that comes from. Here's a people who essentially own their own country, broke away from the ugly rule, right, of colonizers a very long time ago. You, depending on where you're moving around, you hardly see white people there. And for a South African, that's a very unusual thing because we have become very accustomed to live with all types of people in this country. Other South Africans, people of Indian descent, who have settled here and identify with being South African more than they do with their ancestral lineage, if you will, right? Because this is the home they know, and many of them, this is the only home that they know. So we've become accustomed to that level of diversity. And I don't claim to know Nigeria very well at all. I've only been there a couple of times, right? And so you may have had a different experience, but that was a very particular thing. And from people I know that they've said, absolutely, that's very key. This is our country, and they carry themselves in that way. South Africans are different. And I think it'll take a long time before we can walk around that freely, that proudly, that boldly, and say, this is our land, we own this place, and carry ourselves with the confidence that Nigerians do. And so that way of operating, they take the world over. And it offends people who feel as though your confidence, I don't view as inspirational, but if anything, I view your confidence as a threat. But it doesn't help that it doesn't end at just a level of confidence. But if anything, this attitude of entitlement, that I can just show up, do things the way I want, set up where I want, create a mini Lagos, create a mini Abuja, a mini Jos State, or wherever you want, without an appreciation for the people of the land where you have settled. And I think fundamentally, in addition to issues around crime and the movement of banned substances and so on in the country, I mean, that's one thing that I think we can all agree on. Even Nigerians themselves, many of them would agree on how wrong that sort of thing is, and that those who are in fact perpetrators of that criminal activity, that they must be brought to book, that the law must take its course. So that for me is the easy part, right? It's the ways in which you offend a people by just walking into their land, walking into their space, and saying you are going to be all of who you are, and show very little to no regard for the practices of those people, for what it is that drives them, for who they are. And when you come into a country like South Africa, because of how diverse we are, you actually going to if you are honest and really care about getting to know the people with whom you seek to share space, it's going to take time to understand how Amazulu are, what being an Afrikaner means in this country, what being a colored person means in this country, what being a Motswana means, right? And so the list continues. But that's not what we saw, certainly not from the lot who thought it's wise for us to come in and say we are going to install our own king. Government tried to downplay it and said, no, why are you people taking it seriously? It was a silly thing. We don't take it seriously. It should not have caused the outrage that it did. As we often see with society, you never can quite predict what the issue will be, that as you would with any society in trying to understand the behavior of any particular group, you're not quite sure what the thing will be that gets the group to erupt, right? Unrest in 2021, sure, the catalyst or the trigger may have been the arrest of the former President Jacob Zuma, but some studies will also show you that there's at any given point anything, or there were a number of issues, if you will, that will make the masses get up, and there's unrest and there's protests and so on. It's just a question of what the issue will be at that particular point. In 2021, it was the unrest of President Zuma. But given the issues of unemployment and happiness with service delivery and a range of other issues in this country, it really could be anything. And so a couple of weeks ago, what was that issue? It was the fact that there was this king that was installed of Nigerian descent, and that there were no processes followed, but just a group of people who very arrogantly and boldly said, this is what we're doing, we're installing our own king, and we've got every right to do so. And of course, it took a bit of time, but some mobilization driven in part by groups that are based in KZN and are growing and having a presence across the country, and said, people of Kugombo, you can't just sit there. How are you okay with this? And so they organized a protest. as would be expected, started off okay. And then there was trouble. And the trouble, to be fair to the people who organized the march, started while they were busy with their formal program. The knocking on shops and doing all sorts of things and the beating up of people happened when the official group was in another part. But this sort of thing was to be expected. Were the cops prepared? I'm not sure if this was entirely the case, because it seemed as though they had no handle of what was happening there, or at least not a good enough handle of what was happening there. Now, I don't know about you. If you have some level of consciousness, it should upset you when people with the same hue as you are going at each other like this. We know we have a history of fighting amongst ourselves. We have a history of the instigation of those fights coming from outside and making us fight each other. And that's terrible. But it's also important to state that if you are somebody with the same hue as me and are busy with operations that kill our own through substance abuse, where you are killing generations through substance abuse, where you're not following the laws and the rules of the land that we are subjected to, you too are doing the exact same thing that the instigators of so-called black on black violence, right, if we still use those terms, actually wanted. That's also xenophobic. That's also hating other black people when you think it's okay to push drugs and various substances in this country that are killing predominantly Black South Africans. It's frightening to see the number of people we see on our streets. Just the other day, driving through Sandton, seeing young men, I saw about 4 or so on different corners. They still look relatively fresh. They don't look like they've been on the streets for a while. And you can see they're not okay. They're in conversation on their own. They're wondering about the city. Those are people's children. They were all men, young men whose families invested in them. And now they wander the streets of Johannesburg, hooked on substances or battling some or other mental illness, if you will. Again, not trying to diagnose them just from what we are seeing. And so if you are profiting from that sort of practice, you are not one of us. And you deserve the wrath and more that the people of this country will give you. You deserve the full might of the law to come for you, because you are trying to kill generations before their futures are even realized. And it's even more heartbreaking when it's people with the same amount of melanin, with the same dark and rich hair that we are so proud of as Africans, who are okay with profiting from killing our people. That is xenophobic. That is Afrophobic. That is hateful. In fact, that is evil. And I'm convinced that the people in East London, the people in KZN and various parts of the country who are standing up and are saying enough is enough, at the heart of them doing this is that. Because they are tired of the struggle of living with young people who are addicted to substances, and it never ends. In some or other fashion, it's happening. The cost to their lives, the cost to this country. So in addition to the issues of inequality, unemployment, weak economic systems, no jobs, and all of that, at the heart of it is that we are watching our people being killed on a daily basis. And in order for us to understand it, and again, not justifying behavior, not justifying breaking rules, we're just saying, let's contextualize what is happening here. Because merely saying, oh, South Africans are xenophobic is not helpful. Merely saying, oh, all these Nigerians are here selling drugs, also not helpful. And it's important for us to have a conversation that pushes us forward. So coming back to this idea of African unity, is it natural? I think it is. But it's not automatic. It must be worked on. It must be built on shared values. It must be built on living with each other, but in a spirit of honoring each of our cultures, honoring each of our ways of doing life, and agreeing, right, on values that progress all of us as a people. So unity is not automatic. It's maintained through trust, through cooperation, mutual respect, and honest conversations. Without these, then unity just becomes symbolic. It becomes rhetorical and fragile. And I think we've reached yet another level of that fragility. So perhaps the problem is not that unity is failing. It's that we have mistaken aspiration for reality. So what are we not addressing that we need to start talking to? Prejudice between African communities, cultural stereotypes that are pervasive, the issues of economic competition, and the ways in which we treat each other. And we must go there because it's uncomfortable. It challenges this idea of solidarity, but avoiding this conversation does not preserve unity. It weakens it. Because real unity is not the absence of tension. It is the ability to confront it honestly. And this is where leadership needs to rise, because there can never be a vacuum. When leaders that have the trust of the people sit back and don't speak out when issues like these come up, other voices will come up. Other people will take the space, and they may not lead with the same values that at least we hope a democratic country like ours will espouse and want to push forward. And when that happens, you must accept it. Because when you fail to show up as elected leaders whose people's trust you actually hold, if you don't show up, the space will in fact be occupied. So shame on you for keeping quiet when you needed to speak out and speak up for the people of South Africa. So don't come and now call activists names. Don't come up and say, hey, vigilante groups, hey, xenophobic groups, and so on, because people have taken up the space. You have failed. And so you must hold yourself to account. But in addition to that, convene people, gather people around, and let's be honest about what's happening on this continent. It's not just about saving face so that when you travel the world as political leaders, you can then say, oh, no, it's just those groups. This is not who we are. No, it very much is who you are, because you are part of this society. So what are you doing about it in order to ensure that we are building, that it is progressive, and that we do not see the ugly scenes that we saw in 2019? Here's the reality we cannot ignore. Africa's future is interconnected. It's interconnected economically, politically, culturally. Trade agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area depend on collaboration. Innovation depends on cross-border movement. Growth depends on shared opportunity. Cooperation is not idealistic. It is necessary for the prosperity of this continent. But it does not happen automatically. It requires intentional relationship building, fair economic systems, stronger governance, and a shift in how we see each other as people, as Africans. African unity is a powerful idea, an incredibly powerful idea. But ideas alone are not enough. If we are not willing to confront the tensions between us, we cannot build the future we imagine together. And so perhaps the real question is not, are we united? But rather, are we willing to do the work required for us to become so? I am Sebenzile Nkambule, and this is Context. Until next time, stay curious, stay honest, and keep the context. Thank you for watching.